Hey, what's up, guys? It is Friday night. I'm so excited. I have my friend Benjamin Lerner here. I'm really excited because I'm a really big fan of his music and his recovery platform. So I am really just excited to get to know everything about him and about his story. Benjamin, thank you so much for coming on and being willing to come on my crazy platform.
Well, your crazy awesome platform. I'm a big fan of your platform too. Love the work you're doing, recovering out loud, breaking stigma, talking about your spiritual path. I'm a big fan too.
So, okay, tell me, how long have you been in recovery for?
I like to say all I got's one day at a time, but my clean date is June 13th, 2016.
Cool. And you are a sober dad, which I think is freaking amazing.
Yes. Sober parents for the win. I love my
Yes.
old man.
And how old is he?
He is 17 months, about to be 18 months, and we got number 2 coming supposedly January 3rd.
No way. That is so awesome. Babies are such a blessing.
Yes, they
Wow.
are. Absolutely a blessing. Amazing
So,
teachers too.
oh yeah, for sure. And the older that they get, they will teach you more.
I'm excited for all the lessons. Let's keep it going.
Yeah, I have a 13 and a 19-year-old.
Oh, wow.
So
That's awesome. Heck yeah.
they teach me a lot.
Oh, I bet. I'm ready for adolescence. Bring it on. I can't
Oh,
wait for the first time I put on like a song that was so popular, like in my youth or my adolescence, and my kid just cringes and like rolls up the windows. I cannot wait for that to happen for the first time.
okay, so and how if you don't mind me asking, how old are you?
I'm 32. That's weird because it was literally like 3 days ago. So I almost said 31 because my birthday was on Tuesday, but 32 now.
Awesome. Okay, so you guys are kind of like young parents in here. Not too young though.
My
Um,
girlfriend's younger than me. She's 23, so she's like Gen X, and I'm a millennial. But yeah, fairly young. But
okay. And you are up in Vermont?
yeah, I'm up in Vermont, but I'm born and raised Washington, D.C., a little bit further down Route 95. But living in Vermont for the past half decade, and I love it up here.
It's beautiful there.
It's so
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up in New Hampshire, so I did
oh, awesome. Where
yeah,
about, if you don't mind me asking?
Manchester.
Oh, sweet. I went to a recovery event over there a little while back. They got a great scene over there. It was cool.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and I went to Plymouth State College. It's like one of the number one party schools.
Oh, yeah.
So that was I only lasted there for a little while. It wasn't successful. But anyway. Huh?
I was the same way. I lasted
Yeah.
a semester and a half at University of Miami before I dropped out. Wasn't the right place.
I would say University of Miami, that's a party school for sure.
Yeah, it wasn't the right place for me. I like to think you can get sober anywhere, but as a 19-year-old budding alcoholic and cocaine addict, before I even found my drugs of choice, I had the wrong priorities back then.
So, okay, you were telling me backstage a little bit about how you grew up.
So yeah, I mean, in context with no, I'm sorry. Do the setup. I didn't mean to cut you off like that.
You're good. Like with your, I mean, just like with your background, we're talking about like your spiritual upbringing.
Yeah, for sure. So my parents are both half Christian, half Jewish, ethnically. And they were both raised by families with kind of interesting splits on religious thought. His dad was a Russian immigrant who immigrated from Belarus, and his whole life was Jewish, but didn't make his kids get bar mitzvahed or anything. And then his mother was raised, I believe, half Irish Catholic, half German Protestant, but she was a very kind of academic thinker, and she had the Christmas tree and was more, I hate to say commercial, but it was more about the cultural implications of Christmas. But her mother was half Jewish, half Christian. My great-grandfather was an American composer by the name of Irving Berlin, and he was a Jew, but some of his most famous songs were Christmas songs, like White Christmas. And so growing up, she was a Jewish girl, half and half Christian, who was not very religious because in assimilating to America as an Ellis Island immigrant at that time, my grandfather kind of abandoned his ethnic and religious identity, and that got passed on to her. But the most religious person that influenced one of my parents was my mother's father. And he was a Dutch Episcopal man who imbued my mom with a real love of Christianity from the start. And growing up, I mostly was Christian in terms of celebrations, but we did light the menorah on Hanukkah. I only got gifts for Christmas, and we didn't belong to a synagogue, but my mom belonged to a church. She would take me to the National Cathedral in D.C., so I got to see this incredibly beautiful Episcopal tradition, and I went to a school that was very Jewish. So I went to a lot of bar mitzvahs. And so I kind of got torn between both sides. And growing up, the kids were nice, you know. I had my series of social problems like anybody, especially someone in recovery. But, you know, people would ask me, are you Christian? Are you Jewish? And it wasn't just in terms of religion, it was also ethnicity. And so I kind of had, just like I had a identity split with my parents getting divorced, with me having all these mental health issues that led to my addiction, separate from any spiritual turmoil. I had all these beautiful paths and degrees of atheism and agnosticism and Catholicism and Protestant and Jewish that I'm being exposed to, and it was confusing to say the least. So I like to say I always believed in God, even though at a certain point when people asked, I just told them I was atheist because that was like the in vogue thing to be at the time. But I was agnostic for many years because to me, God was always more about a ceremony and an ethnicity, in my understanding, before I found God, than it was about my connection with a higher power. So I don't blame my parents for raising me the way they did because they had a lot of stuff going on too. But all these different influences kind of coalesced in my mind to the point I got detached from even really considering what a spiritual side of God was for many years.
So, okay, you come into recovery. How did you come into recovery?
The Spark Notes version, to use a millennial term, would be that after years of escalating addiction that started with alcohol and cannabis and cocaine and ecstasy in social situations in high school to cope with, separate from my autism spectrum diagnosis, just incredible feelings of sensory overload, anxiety, and just feeling like I didn't deserve basic human happiness, which ties into my spiritual distress as well. I learned later on in recovery, but wasn't aware of it at that time. It was just emotional and physical tension I was aware of there, but there was spiritual tension as well. And that, you know, if you've heard a bunch of opioid addict stories, I bet you've heard a million, but mine is pretty much cookie cutter. Got prescribed opioids after thinking I was too good for them. I did coke. I binge drank. That was one line I wouldn't cross. And went from popping perks to 30s and snorting those, snorting dope, shooting dope, smoking crack, and the little suburban autism spectrum piano playing kid turned into a spoon and stem and tinfoil dope fiend with tracks on his arms, nothing but hope and sadness and hate and resentment in my heart. And I in and out of treatment for years, crossed every line I swore I wouldn't cross, burnt every bridge. But my mom found her spiritual path, and she found recovery 5 years before I did. And thank God for that, because she was there for me when everybody else gave up. And when I was finally ready, she helped me get into treatment. And I had a lot of spiritual experiences on my way there and while I was there that I didn't really tie to any specific higher power. But when the chemical fog parted, a lot of people have the spiritual experience first. Like in certain recovery fellowships, I won't get too fellowship specific for anonymity or whatever, but like in the main text, it's like the founder has a spiritual experience. I didn't have that so much as my first spiritual experience was understanding before I connected it to God that there was a power greater than myself to be found in recovery. A lot of people have a religious or spiritual epiphany and then go to recovery. Mine was the recovery epiphany. And then from there, as the fog lifted and I became more in touch with my emotions and my spirituality, not tied to anything, I became more aware of a need to find a spiritual path that really resonated with me. And that started happening in early recovery. That need, not just to be sober, but feel connected to a power greater than myself.
So that's interesting. So when I worked the steps, that's like how I got into my relationship with God, because it was like I was working these steps, right? And you have like your step 3 or whatever, right? You know, giving your will and your life, your thoughts and your actions to the care of God as you understand him, right? And then I had my 4th step and, had to go over, with my sponsor. And it was like, I had all of these things wrote down, all these resentments, sexual inventory. It was like a whole notebook this big, like all this stuff, right? Like, like, God, okay, you want me to hand over my will and my life, my thoughts and my actions. But I'm sitting here looking at this inventory and what I know of you growing up as a Sicilian Catholic is that I'm in really big trouble, right? Looking at all these things I did, right? Like I am screwed, and I can't pray enough rosaries to get myself out of this. Like, I don't even know how you feel about me. And that was the big question, like, do you even like me? Are you mad at me? Is that why I've had all of this destruction in my life? Like, what is it? Did you have that kind of like similar thing where you had to like understand like how God felt about you?
Well, if we're talking about steps, you know what? I got enough old heads saying I'm breaking traditions. I'm still not going to say specific fellowship, but let's talk about steps. The language I use, people already know what's good with me. And if you don't, yes, the rooms have played a crucial role in my recovery, and they continue to, although I do not speak on it directly in my content because I don't want to be an out member of it. Because I was traumatized early on after treatment, like even posting private Facebook statuses. People threw me in a cage over that. I'm still trying to get out of it. But yeah, the first person I worked with in a sponsorship capacity actually had an interesting spiritual story too. He was born and raised in deeply Bible Belt, West Virginia, but he took a separate spiritual path. And I don't know if it was Benedictine, but it was some kind of monastery in the mountains out there in Tennessee somewhere. And he became this close to becoming a monk. But while he was there, he realized that even though he did believe in God and Christ, that it was not the spiritual path for him, and his life being closed off in that way, although the monastic life is beautiful, it just wasn't for him. And so he realized that he had to stop drinking. He was an alcoholic monk who, instead of giving up his right to talk and socialize, gave up his right to drink and got his life back. And he was 3 years sober when I met him in the rooms, and we started working together. And like I said, I had a spiritual experience at treatment. The first one was where I looked in the mirror. And, I still got blemishes to this day. I still got scars on my face. That's why I use filters on my reels. But no filter here. Like, I got pock marks. I'm not ashamed of them. But like, I hated myself so much because at the time when I was in treatment about to leave, I had scabs on my face, like, really scraggly beard. But I saw into my eyes in this mirror, this reflective surface. And I think soul is a word that gets thrown around. And at that time, I don't know if I saw my soul, but I saw the spiritual being beneath everything. I saw that I was more than my appearance, more than my neurochemicals. I saw there was potential deep within. And I know this sounds so corny, but a voice spoke to me after I don't know if it came from within, from God, whatever, but I had called a cab to leave the treatment center, and it just yelled at me, "Do not get in the cab. Stay here." And I don't know if that was subconscious or God. Today, I have a better understanding of my spiritual connection versus my inner subconscious, but back then I didn't. But it was so powerful, and it was something I'd never felt before, which was faith. And I couldn't articulate it as any God. But yes, I did have this, am I worth saving? Do I deserve? Because for a long time, I had thought that God was a punisher, but really it was God is a giver. But do I deserve to open my hands when they've been closed so long, to recovery, to life, to God? And then I had a second spiritual experience with the aforementioned sponsor when we're doing 4 and 5. And I did it right after I made a stupid move in early recovery. They say you're supposed to wait a year. If that, I waited 6 days in treatment. And that was the reason I wanted to leave treatment, was because I made my higher power another person when the drugs were out of my system. And we had made up, we stopped hooking up, but I was still talking with her and she was still my higher power, even though I had completed treatment. But then she ghosted me, and I was at a point where the drugs were gone, the codependency was gone. I was an empty shell, but that brought me further in touch with that spirit, the same way getting sober brought me closer to my spirit too. And I called my dealer. My dealer didn't pick up. I was 6 months sober. I'm going to be honest. But my sponsor did pick up. And I was like, I don't know. And it was perfect serendipity. We were about to do the 4th step. And this dude who's like a monk, this great West Virginia voice, I said, I don't want to do my 4th step today. He's like, what's wrong, Ben? And I'm like, well, I'm heartbroken. I just called. He's like, you're coming down and we're doing it today. And I sit in this room with this man, and he's kind of like a complete stranger to me, and he's nothing like me. And I've written this list, and he interrupts me halfway through. He's like, I don't want to hear just like the little things. He's like, that's not how we're doing this. You haven't expressed any pain. I haven't seen any tears come up in your eyes. Rip that list up and tell me about the things you don't want to tell anybody. This is not an exercise in writing and talking. This is an exercise in talking to me, talking to your higher power, and being vulnerable in a way you're afraid to be. So you want to run with drugs and relationships and all the other things you're talking about. And I looked at the ground and I started trembling, and I felt just this light pierce me. And I said, I'll never forget the words I said. I said, I'm afraid that I don't deserve happiness. I'm afraid that God will never forgive me. My family will never forgive me. I will never forgive me. I'm afraid I don't deserve to be sober, and I'm afraid I don't deserve anyone's love or God's love. And it almost makes me cry saying it now. And he looked at me and he said, Ben, I'm not God, but I believe in God, and I believe that God thinks that you and me are good people, and we deserve a spiritual solution. And we cried and hugged, and I walked through that 5th step, and I felt a huge weight over my shoulders. And 2 weeks after that, this guy at work, because I got my first job, started talking to me about Jesus Christ. And it was a beautiful coincidence, because at the point where those weights were lifted and I was pushed towards that solution in my recovery, another door opened, and that was my spiritual solution waiting for the time when I was ready for it.
Wow. Ben, he thought you were worth dying for.
Amen.
Yes. Oh my goodness. That is powerful. Friend, you got some ministry in you. Got some ministry in you.
I try to speak openly and honestly with people about my recovery and my faith. I've been trying to make it part of my platform with people who reach out to me on the messages, who are not just struggling in recovery, but struggling with faith, and those who are on the same path as me, talking about Christ and recovery. I have open conversations with them. And it's a beautiful thing that it can serve as an affirmation of both faith and recovery and God. Because even though I haven't made it that central of a part of my recovery platform yet, in the conversations I do have with people about not just recovery, but God, I find it gets deeper in a way that pure recovery conversations can. And that's why I'm so grateful to have this conversation, because it's a dimension of this that I don't really get to talk about in my normal recovery advocacy work.
Mm-hmm. And so I am so curious as to how were you able to accept and receive the forgiveness from God?
So there's this guy, and I'm not going to use his name. He would probably want me to, because he does international ministry work, but I don't know if he wants to be on like a recovery platform or whatever. I don't know. He's an old school guy. So I'm not going to use his name, but I worked at a restaurant. And other than recovery and my, at this point, just kind of budding faith that hasn't found a home, my job and the lessons I learned there was a foundational core of getting my life back in sobriety. And other than the rooms and faith in my family and everything else. And he was a dude I really respected. And I knew that he was Christian because he wore it on his sleeve. And he took me aside one time. He's like, well, how's your life going? He supported my recovery. He's like, but he always told me, he's like, you know, getting sober is great, but like, you need to find God. And I rolled my eyes and I was like, well, I'm starting to believe in God. It almost felt like he was pushing it on me. But then all of a sudden he stopped. He realized that for me, it required a different tack. And he just said, let me ask you something. What does God look like to you? And I said, to me, my favorite thing about Christ is mercy and forgiveness. And he says, yes. He says, so have you read the Bible? And I said, no, I haven't. I haven't done it since I was a little kid. My parents asked me if I wanted to go to Sunday school, and I said no. And he said, what if I gave you my King James just to read? And I said, well, I'm searching for a spiritual solution. I'd be open to it. But still in my head, it was like, this man was hardcore Joel Osteen Pentecostal. Nothing against that. I support all paths of faith, Christianity included. It's different. But like, he was hardcore, brimstone, all that. And that was not my conception. But like I said before we hopped on, just like people can have different paths of recovery and they can still help us, he helped me to the extreme. And I did something just on a lark. And this is a God-based talk, so I'm going to go there. I'm going to do the first scripture of the night. We're going to go there. I Googled my sobriety date, which is 6/13/16. Just that, 6/13/16. But instead of I wanted to hit the slash, but instead I hit the semicolon, and Google corrected as a colon, like a verse number. So I just wanted to do that, like look up what happened on my sobriety day, because I was interested in the news, because I wanted to like remember it by like what happened on that day, separate from that. And this verse came up. And it's Romans 6:13/16 from the NIV, although I have a KJV. Nothing against the NIV, I just like the KJV better. But this is the thing I read, and that's Romans 6:13-16, which is, do not offer any part of yourself as sin to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness, for sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law, but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness? And that was when I found Jesus. And the reason why is that someone told me in treatment, separate from God, when I was like, well, I don't want to have to go to meetings every day. That same thing, like, I don't want to be a slave to recovery, just like I was a slave to need. And he's like, exactly. You are a slave to working your program of recovery or to the needle. The choice is yours. You should choose recovery because you deserve it. Because even though you might never escape having to work on it, that path is going to take you to life, and the needle is going to take you to death. And to see that message paralleled in the compassion, mercy, and love of the universal Christ consciousness that I choose to call my higher power, reflected through my sobriety date, and the numbers aligning in that way at that moment to give me the message that not only did I have the privilege of being alive and able to walk towards God, but that my master being God and Christ was a gift and a rebirth that perfectly coalesced with my recovery. And they were inextricably tied together and always had been, even when I didn't have faith. And from that moment on, just like my recovery hasn't been perfect, even though I haven't picked up, that's the one thing I've done perfectly. And even though my faith hasn't been perfect, even though I've never stopped believing, that was the moment where my recovery and my faith in Christ came together. And it was just all at once. It was like, wow, just that coincidence was too much for me. And from that point, I never stopped believing in Jesus Christ as my path in faith.
Wow. That is awesome.
Yeah.
Bro, you need to be on college campuses talking about recovery. Like that I'm telling you, you've got it. You're super anointed, man. You're super anointed.
Likewise. Your message is incredible, and the way you articulate it. I was watching a reel you did the other day about loving yourself for like the ladies in the sober houses. I was like, yep. I know that culture all too well. So you have an incredible message as well, the way you articulate it, and spread the love of God too. So thank you so much for the kind words.
So I have a question. Do you believe that there is a spiritual side to addiction?
Yes, I do. And I don't think, and this is where a lot of people lose me on both sides. I had a friend who is decidedly atheist, but is sober from dope, even though he didn't choose the rooms or chemical abstinence. But he's doing well. I don't know how he does it. He's something else. But he's a man who I intellectually respect very much, although our spirituality does not align, who I used to use with. And the way that I got him into treatment when he was ready, tried a lot of times he wasn't ready, was I told him the following. I said, he's like, I don't want to work the steps. I don't believe in God. I said, yeah, but you believe in the bag. and you turn your will and your life and your faith over to that bag and that spoon and that plug and that bundle every time. So I don't want to hear that you don't have faith. You just don't have faith in recovery. You don't have God, and you don't have faith in yourself. And I improvised it, like kind of BSing it 1 through 12, like with the bag is the higher power. And that made him realize, wow, I've been, just like we said, like captured, like held prisoner by this the whole time. And I've turned my will over to it. And the next day he was in treatment. So even though he didn't have the spiritual path, he used to always tell me, he's like, the only time I've ever been close to believing in God was when I was high on dope. And what I say now to people who are so ashamed for seeking out peace artificially, chemically, through that needle and that bottle, that crack pipe, meth pipe, whatever, there is no shame in seeking peace. I was just seeking, and I'm not a bad person because I sought that peace through a destructive chemical that is not the light and love of God, who rips that euphoria away and takes you straight to literal chemical neurological hell on earth. Mm-hmm. So I tell people, you're not a bad person for chasing that light in the bag, but that light in the bag is so tiny and flimsy and artificial and destructive, and that light of God is endless. So I tell people who say, is addiction spiritual? Addiction to me, and this is just me, is a spiritual chase where we put all of our spiritual energy towards destruction, not because we are bad people, but because we do not believe we are deserving of God's love. And for me, the second I realized that God and recovery could be there if I took like 1/10 of that energy I put towards chasing dope on a spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical level towards recovery, I would get millions exponentially times as much light, warmth, love, faith, fellowship, and meaning as I got in that miserable bag. So yes, I do. And I think that people who chase dope and crack and whatever are not godless, not faithless. They just might have faith in the wrong thing and not enough faith in themselves and their ability to connect with real spirituality.
Yep. I always say no high like the most high.
That's right. I love that. I love that. That's a beautiful phrase.
Yes, I've never felt, I'm telling you, like the intimacy that I have felt in the presence of God, the Holy Spirit just being heavy on me. I mean, that is like better high than any Roxy could have ever given me. Ever.
I know that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And
awesome.
it's so incomprehensible when you are in active addiction, regardless of whether you were born with that innate spirituality or not. It robbed me even of my basic spiritual curiosity for so long. And I'm grateful I ain't got to live that way anymore.
So, okay, last thing I want to ask you is, for those out here who are struggling to accept God's love because they don't feel that they are worthy of it, or because they maybe have been through some circumstances where they're like, where were you at, God, when this happened? You know, like if there was really a God, then why did these bad things happen? What would you say to them?
I tell people who are Christian, who subscribe to Buddhism, whatever, the same thing. But specifically I'll orient this in a Christian path because that's my faith and I can only speak for myself. But all interpretations, all spirituality, it's there. You know what I mean? Like, I know that's such an oversimplification, but I didn't know the dope block was there when I went out to cities where I would use in the future with my dad as a young kid. I saw the people like ducking off into corners, knotted out on the street, although the opioid epidemic wasn't as bad, but I walked through the same neighborhood, saw the same sights, but I didn't know what it was. And similarly in active addiction, when I went to use out in San Francisco in the Tenderloin, where I hit rock bottom on black tar heroin and crack, I walked past the missions, the churches. I would see a big cross up on that hill, literally glinting in the light when I was sprinting back dope sick to hit my vein. But it was invisible to me because even though I knew what a church was, I didn't know what a church was. I didn't know what it was to me. And what I would also say is it's so important, just like in recovery, to listen to other spiritual teachers, because just like recovery, I don't have all the answers. I would be hubris to think that I could even conceive of 1/1000th of something as infinite as God and Christ and God and Christ, a mighty and universal knowledge and omnipotence. But the same thing can be said for recovery. I don't understand everything about recovery. But if I can sense that someone's recovery is not in alignment with mine, just like someone's faith isn't in alignment with mine, I don't have to hate them. I don't have to let them be a roadblock to me. Because just like recovery, I'd see people in the rooms when I wasn't ready to get clean. I'd be like, I don't like them. It's not for me. Same thing with my spirituality. I can see people, oh, that's not for me. But don't let that hold you back from finding the spiritual peace you deserve in recovery. Because just like recovery in itself, your spiritual path is out there. And my spiritual path is the divine love and consciousness and universal presence of Jesus Christ, Yeshua, as my Jewish ancestors would say. Whatever you choose, it's there, and you deserve not just to be sober, but to find the spiritual path of love and divine light and harmony that works for you. You deserve it, and don't let anybody take that from you.
Very well said. Benjamin, thank you. Blessed and highly favored.
Blessed up. Bless you too. Thank you for letting me do this. This has been amazing, and I'm looking forward to doing some faith content in the near future. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but the warmth and peace I feel talking about this for the first time on this platform has been amazing, and I hope I can do it moving forward some more.
For sure. Let's see. We're going to end here.